Feel honored to be sharing with you this morning. As Dan said, a relatively new resident to Lynchburg, been here 2 years. But in that time, I've appreciated coming to learn the history of your church and the work you do and the legacy your community holds in this city. So every time I'm on your campus setting, from University of Lynchburg campus to your setting, I feel it's a sacred and holy place. So I'm glad to be spending some time with you. I'm not going to deliver a sermon per se. I'm not going to do an exegetical, in-depth sermon of Greek and Hebrew, but I do want to share a little bit, as Dan and I talked a little bit about kind of my own spiritual journey. And then I want to kind of float an idea past you that I think will resonate with you, but I think it's going to resonate with you because from what I know of you, I think it reflects who you are as a community. So as Dan mentioned, I work at the University of Lynchburg in the Spiritual Life Center. I'm the associate chaplain there. And we moved here, our family moved here in July of 2018. So just hit our 2-year mark. We were in Rhode Island prior to this. My wife and I were both working for a church there. She had been there for about 10 years and I was there for 6. And then we have 2 little boys, Foster and Theo. Foster's 4.5 and Theo is 1.5. So as I told some people, I'm in the basement. So if you hear them running or if it sounds like my house is collapsing, it's because they're running upstairs and having a pretty fun time. I grew up outside of Chicago in a suburb in a pretty relatively homogenous community and in a relatively conservative Christian household. And so my family was split actually between the 2 branches of Lutheranism. Half of us were Missouri Synod, right? The very conservative Missouri Synod denomination. The other half were ELCA. And we still had family dinners together all the time. We also, if you know Chicago, half of us were Chicago White Sox fans and the other half were Chicago Cubs fans. And that's like a major rivalry of baseball in Chicago. So Lutheranism and baseball, our family was quite at odds. Fist fights every chance we had. Not really, but it made for lively conversation, to say the least. But I grew up loving all things musical theater and eventually went to undergrad to get a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Musical Theater Performance and then set out on a career as a professional singer and actor. And during that time, I lived in about 10 different states, traveling all over the country, working at different theme parks and dinner theaters and regional theaters. And I did Christmas shows every year for, I don't know, years. So I'm kind of bah humbug when it comes to Christmas music because from October until January, I was singing Christmas music every year for years. But I did some Shakespeare, musical theater, and through basically some really random events that basically occurred on a yearly basis, some random event, I felt this draw to become a pastor. Whether it was sitting in a coffee shop and someone coming up and asking if I was a pastor, to leading a Bible study and actually a gentleman was a part of it and he said, have you ever thought about being a pastor? Just kind of those little nuggets of, hey, think about this. And I never went through with it. And eventually I tore a ligament in my knee while I was performing, which made me drop out of all my acting work. I returned back home to Chicago, had knee surgery. And during the healing process, it was kind of one of those, every single door miraculously opened for me to enter seminary. Which I did at North Park Theological Seminary, which is on the north side of Chicago. Everything from an apartment to scholarships to loans to getting in classes that put me ahead. It just kind of one of those things like, all right, I'm going to pursue this. And so in those following years, I got my MDiv, wrote a thesis, worked as a hospital chaplain and spent some time working in campus ministry in Chicago, worked for a nonprofit in Chicago that worked to build bridges between the LGBTQ community and the Christian community. And for me, my years in seminary were this season of identity change, where I went from being an actor and an artist, and I thought my worth came from what I did. I thought my worth came from the applause that I would get after performing in a show. And affirmation came real quickly, right? When you're in a musical and you sing a song, people immediately clap, whether they think you're good or not. They usually do clap. And it moved from this identity of performance and an identity of approval from others to an identity of being a human, a beloved child of God, simply because I was a human being, not because I was performing, not because I did anything well, simply because I was and am. And that was a difficult journey, just as all identity changes kind of are. And from there, I eventually fell in love and moved to Rhode Island. And that's where I worked for a church, and also where Kate and I got married. And it was during that season where actually things spiritually started to change. And what I discovered within a few years after working for a church, within a few years of being in full-time ministry, of preaching, of pastoring, of creating these programs, all these things I felt like I was called to do. Like God said to me, you need to be doing these things. You've left this career. You started this career. This is what you're supposed to be doing. And within just a few years, I was so overwhelmed with ministry, with life, and I was completely burnt out. And now, I mean, there are all sorts of reasons. Some of it was my own doing. Some of it was just the busyness of life. Some of it was work-life boundaries. Some of it was the context I found myself in the church and the congregation. But relatively quickly after being in ministry, I was just kind of tired, worn out. I was overworked, and I felt completely unprepared for ministry. And I sensed something deep in my soul was aching for something more, longing for something more. And actually, it all came to a head for me one Easter Sunday, where at the time the church that I was working for was kind of going through some budget cuts and staffing changes and pushing some of our staff out. And I was one of those people. And I felt completely numb. And I remember an Easter Sunday standing in the back of the school that we rented out, almost like an out-of-body experience in some ways. And everyone was worshiping Jesus in this church context. And after the sermon, they were singing a song about resurrection. And here I was, one of the pastors on staff, standing in the back. And I was watching this whole situation. And I just had this moment where I felt like I started praying, God, I need the resurrection. Something deep in my soul, like I need a resurrection. Things are numb. And the faith that I knew, the faith that I was raised in, it just didn't work anymore. The worship songs didn't connect. The prayers I prayed were kind of seemed pointless to me. Reading the Bible became something I just did because I thought I had to. And I just became more and more critical and apathetic in the church rather than becoming, I thought, a better Christian in the church. And so the dream of pastoring wasn't as great of a dream as I thought it might be. And I constantly was thinking, maybe I should go be an actor again. Maybe I should leave this, or maybe I should go be a bartender because I think I can do more pastoring in a bar than in this church context. And what I discovered is a lot of pastors are burnt out and a lot of Christians are burnt out. I mean, we often don't talk about it, but a lot of us have grown up in a Christian tradition and we're tired of it, or we're sick of volunteering, or church isn't working how it once worked, or the faith itself just it's not leading us into anything deeper. So I started to believe that, and see really that this is a regular rhythm in the spiritual life, and that it follows the pattern of the Christian faith of death and resurrection, right? And that there's a rhythm in our faith where our faith sometimes needs to die and it is buried so that a new, deeper faith and a deeper union with God can be resurrected. So for me, this journey came by discovering ancient and contemplative spirituality, something I think you as a congregation know quite well. And so what I discovered in the journey that I've been on in the last few years, the something new that I was longing for was actually something ancient, something quite old. And God used the ancient, God used the contemplative to really transform my life. And so this journey took me as this evangelical actor from the suburbs. It brought me to discover meditation. And I spent a few years every 3 months going to a monastery and sitting in silence and solitude. I started practicing contemplative prayer and centering prayer and Lectio Divina. And these are the practices that literally revived my soul. They rekindled my faith. They really did transform everything. And even what we shared this morning, right? Centering prayer, 2 minutes in silence. I was never taught that in the church. I was never a part of a community that allowed for silence in a church service. And so Lectio Divina, fixed hour prayer, centering prayer, meditation, each of these like completely resonated with me. And each of them I can tell you a story from each one. The first time I tried centering prayer and how amazing it was for me, or meditation, what that did, or fixed hour prayer, how that really, as I was laying in bed late one night, transformed how I understood what prayer could be. And it wasn't as if I pursued some of these contemplative spiritual practices. It was as if I fell into them, kind of discovered them by accident, but by divine purpose. And through them, I was able to find a deep connection with God in a way that I hadn't in some of my other spiritual practices or churches I had been a part of, or ways I read the Bible previously. So they gave me kind of a renewed hope in Christian faith. It gave me a new identity, one that I claim now is like, I'm a contemplative. I'm trying to see God and the divine in all things and through all things, as the book of Colossians says. And so for me, contemplative practices really allow me to open up to God's presence. And it's not something where I do things, it's where I release control and I learn to be. And I'm like Mr. Achiever. If all those personality tests, I'm like the achieving, task-oriented, to-do list type of person. And these practices force me, right? When you're sitting in silence for 20 minutes and practicing centering prayer, there's not much you can do, but there's a lot you can simply be. And so for me, I'm trying to learn to be more fully human and more in tune with God. And I think some of these practices probably resonate with a lot of you, that these are ways that you as a community have developed your faith tradition, as well as how you find union with God, and serves as a catalyst, right, for your action and your justice and your way to work to make our world a better and whole and more just world and community. So there's the contemplative aspect. So the kind of the term I wanted to throw out with you, because I think you'll resonate with it, and I think you're living it with it, is this term contemplative ecumenical. And for me, this is a new phrase with a new definition. I took some adjectives, I'm turning them into nouns, and it's an identity that probably the last handful of years that I've been just trying on and resonating whether it works. So contemplative ecumenical. And for me, in part of my spiritual journey, I identified as an evangelical. I was a proud evangelical. I went to an evangelical seminary. I'm ordained in an evangelical denomination. But these days, I found that term to no longer mean what it once meant. And so even though evangelical, right, comes from the Greek word euangelion, which means gospel or means the good news, I'm not sure it means that to a lot of people anymore. Now, the Protestant faith tradition that I'm a part of, and that the broader Protestant church tradition that took on that adjective, it's all about people who are passionately willing to share hope and who emphasize this spiritual awakening, who desire transformation, communal transformation, individual transformation. They really honor ancient scriptures and the Bible. They work for justice. They have a longing for people to kind of have this deep, dynamic faith. That's what evangelicalism is supposed to be. And I can get on board with that. I think it's the best of what they could be and should be. But I don't think it means that type of faith anymore. And instead, I think evangelical, unfortunately, has become synonymous with fundamentalists or anti-women or anti-LGBTQ or simply anti-nice or just anti-decent. And even just more recently, we've seen individuals in the news who profess an evangelical faith say things and do things that many of us would probably argue is very unchristian even. And so there's this growing, I think, sense that for many people, evangelicals aren't announcing good news. They're not sharing a story that's hopeful for all people. They're the hope of doing justice and working for the common good for all people somehow is amiss. And so I've become to believe, and I have a lot of friends that resonate with this, that evangelical, that word has become pretty tainted and it's no longer working the way it once did. And there are people who are trying to reclaim it, but I don't think we should reclaim it. I think we should find a new term and a new type of community. And that's what I'm trying to do with this term ecumenical and contemplative ecumenical. And I think it's a phrase that many of us have experienced and brings us into a deeper richness. I think it's a great term that embodies kind of the ancient spiritual practices that many of you know so well that we are practicing together, and what the Jesus tradition is all about. It's enabled us to tell this hopeful story, that people are longing to hear. Richard Rohr, as we actually just heard earlier, he has this great phrase, which I believe he's quoting from others. But Richard Rohr defines contemplative as a long, lovingly look at the real. That when you're contemplating something, or when you are contemplative, you're longing and looking and lovingly admiring the real. There's this great story where Jesus, in the Gospel of Luke, actually turns to the woman who anoints his feet at the dinner. And the text actually says, Jesus said to Simon while looking at the woman, "Do you see this woman?" And I love that phrase, that even though he's talking to someone over here, he's lovingly looking at this woman and says, "Do you see this woman? Do you see who she is?" And I think that's this idea of contemplation, that we are lovingly looking at something and drawing other people's attention to lovingly see that. Oh, do you see that? Do you see what I see? And so it's a way of life as a contemplative to use ancient practices to fall in love with the divine, to see the divine in all things, to see, oh, look at that, good one, God. Now, ecumenical, that's an adjective, and it means promoting unity and oneness among the world's Christian churches. I mean, that's the ecumenical movement, is that, and it seeks cooperation and understanding among different Christian traditions. It values diversity. It embraces differences. It sees everyone as a part of the same community, and it comes from the Greek word oikumene, which means the whole inhabited earth. Excuse me. And it's used a handful of times actually in the Christian scriptures. But many Christian traditions have used it to denote the universal nature of the church, right? Like the whole thing. And what I've found as I've looked at ecumenicalism, and I'm a bit of a theological mutt, like grew up Lutheran, but then attended a Pentecostal church, and then an Assemblies of God, and then a Baptist church, and then I'm pretty sure a Southern Baptist church for a bit, and then an Episcopal church, and then I was a part of this like small Lutheran church that didn't know what it was. Then I was a part of a multi-ethnic church, very like gospel focused church. So I'm a bit of a theological mutt, but I found that ecumenicalism allows us to move back to the essentials, to move back to the apostolic faith, to affirm the creeds, to unite us all so that we might be transformed today. And as the text that Dan read earlier, there's a story of Jesus of Nazareth, right? Before he was executed, he prayed that prayer. And he prayed for people that would come after him, which included us. And he prayed that despite our differences, we might be one. And I love this passage. I've preached on it a lot. But he doesn't ask that we would be theologically correct in all our doctrines. He doesn't believe that we would have the right answers, or that we would agree on everything, or that we would all be a part of the same church community, or that we would evangelize everyone, or that we would all think or pray or worship the exact same way. He prayed what I think is a pretty ecumenical prayer, right? That we would be one, as the text says, so that all people will know God loves them, and that Jesus was sent as the visible reminder of this invisible divine love. That's why we're one. So how people might come to know God is by being one. not by tolerating one another, but truly embracing one another, living into the interconnectedness of all humanity. And that's how the incarnation of the divine will continue when we become evangelical, when we become ecumenicals, when we become people who are one. Now, I don't know about your spiritual journey, but at least for mine, this was not taught in my faith community. I mean, oneness or this type of interconnectedness, it wasn't really esteemed to me or taught to me. Instead, I was taught like my one tradition was the right one and all the other ones were wrong, or my one style of church, my one style of worship was better than all the false ones out there. And what's funny is, as I mentioned, I was a part of a Lutheran church and then a Pentecostal church and a multi-ethnic church. I heard that message in each tradition I was a part of. So like I went to a Lutheran church and heard like, yes, we have it right, but the Episcopalians, they've lost it. And then was a part of a Pentecostal church and it was like, we have the right, we're speaking in tongues, we have it right, but those Lutherans and those Baptists, they don't have it right. And so these are I was never taught like the one whole church was good. But I was taught these other traditions are wrong and we were right. We were the one way. And those other places didn't have, or those other churches didn't really have a place for us or for them. And another thing that was interesting is spiritual practices or rhythms that seemed too Catholic or too Orthodox or too traditional or too evangelical. They didn't have a place in that life, right? Like, and so what deeply saddens me is a lot of the churches that I had been a part of, especially in, contemporary evangelical churches that I had been a part of, we often stripped away so many of the rhythms and liturgies and spiritual practices. Again, these ancient, even these contemplative spiritual practices, we ripped them all away in hopes of being relevant. But what we ended up doing was we ended up losing the richness and the depth and the beauty and the mystery of God. And we actually we became more irrelevant than relevant. Thomas Merton, Dan quoted a few of my favorite people, Thomas Merton, Richard Rohr, John 17, we're on a roll. But he's one of my favorite authors. And I didn't discover him until a few years ago. But he has this passage that I think summarizes this individual attitude. And he says this, let me pull it up here. He says this in his book, Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander. But I think this passage really reflects the dangers of not living as one, as an ecumenical, as one who sees the good in all. And he says this, the more I am able to affirm others, to say yes to them in myself, by discovering them in myself and myself in them, the more real I am. I am fully real if I own my heart and say yes to everyone. I will be a better Catholic, he says, not if I can refute every shade of Protestantism, but if I can affirm the truth in it and still go further. And I think he resonates with exactly what Jesus is saying when we are, when we're one, that we are in God, that God is in us. And then he goes on to say, if I can affirm myself as a Catholic merely by denying all that is Muslim, Jewish, Protestant, Hindu, Buddhist, etc., in the end, I will find there is not much left for me to affirm as a Catholic, and certainly no breath of the Spirit with which to affirm it. And I think Merton, just like everything he writes, I feel like he nails it on the head. But as Christians, we aren't fully human. We're not living as we truly are meant to live. We're not as real as we could be if we don't affirm, as he says, the truth, the universality of each tradition. And that's what I think being an ecumenical means, that we view the church kind of as this diamond. I've used this analogy a lot with students, that we acknowledge that the diamond has multiple facets, right? But rather than thinking like the part over there is unpolished and needs to be removed or chipped away, or that this facet is the one that gleams the brightest. So that's the best one. What I want to do, and what I often teach students and others, is I want to move it around and look at each of the facets and say, look at how beautiful this is. Look how beautiful that piece is. Look at how this is reflecting God's light in the world. Look at how this can impact your soul. And that's, I feel like in the last few years as a pastor, as a Christian, that's kind of, I feel like more and more of my role is to say, look at the beauty that is what's in some of the Episcopal tradition. Oh, look at the beauty that is in the Lutheran tradition, rather than saying, oh, look at the failings of the Episcopal Church. Look at how the Lutheran Church is dying. No, look at how God is moving and seeking beauty in each of these traditions. So for me, it means valuing the richness and the mystery and the uniqueness of each tradition within the great, like, overarching tradition in which we find ourselves. And it means we'll have disagreements, and it'll mean things, that we're not. It means that unity doesn't require uniformity, right? Like, it means that we don't always have to be right, and we don't own the corner of truth, but we're letting each tradition influence our own story and experience. It reminds us that we're living as a family, right? And as the scriptures remind us, when the eye can't say, I have no need for you, to an ear, just as we can't say to someone in another tradition, I have no need for you. Instead, we work to be together, trusting that our particular tradition can come together and be a part of a larger tradition. And it's not simply about it's not simply about tolerating, because who wants to be tolerated? It's about embracing our religious diversity and incorporating the best of each tradition and anchoring ourselves within this contemplative tradition. And I think, as Merton says, that will make us fuller Christians. It will make us more real and more human. And there's, I think, an interfaith component as well, right? That I think that as Christians, we can honor all religious traditions. We can learn from them, respect them, see the good within each of them. And again, Merton points at this in his passage as well, that there can be a refreshingness to this, that we can see other religious traditions not as enemies and not as people to debate, or not as lost people we need to convert, but instead friends with whom we can converse. And I think that's a very different model, when we view people as people we can converse with rather than people we need to convert. And so I've become pretty compassionate and passionate about kind of incorporating these contemplative spiritual practices into my own life. And I especially think it's true for the college students that I work with. I see a massive amount of anxiety, depression, fear, stress, being overwhelmed, and these practices that bring centeredness and calm. And I also think, as we live in this pandemic, that these practices of centering prayer, of fixed hour prayer, of Lectio Divina, these are just as essential, because we're living in a time of grief and unknown and trauma and stress. And so these are the practices that I think can really sustain our faith, that can revive our faith. And for me, they quite literally saved my soul. So some of the ways I said I'm kind of a mutt, but I love, like, gospel music, right? So I love gospel music. I do fixed hour prayer with the Episcopal Church's Book of Common Prayer. I have some icons in my office. I try to spend a good 10 minutes a day in centering prayer and meditation. I study sermons like a good evangelical, but I also think communion is probably the best sermon than any preacher could ever preach. I'm trying to read authors from a different tradition, from a different gender than I am. And I do this, again, as Thomas Merton says, that so I can be a fuller Christian, a realer Christian, and one who honors and affirms and sees God in all. Because just as Christianity believes, I believe God has been on the move, is still on the move, and God is making all things new, that God is up to something good in our world, even when it doesn't seem like that is the case. And so that's, for me, I want to see this movement of contemplative ecumenicals. It may not catch on, that's all right. But I think we can live an ancient faith We can experience glimpses of the divine, and we can still be transformed by this God today. So it's my hope that we don't fall in love just with like our church tradition, like our little local church, but we can fall in love with the holy, apostolic, Catholic, universal church, right? Like the creed says. It's my hope that we can stand not in awe of just one particular tradition, but we can stand in awe of the whole great tradition. And it's my hope that we can practice a faith, not only with just a few Christians because they think and act and vote like us, but that we can actually practice a faith with the whole of the Christian tradition. And then it's my hope that we don't see God just in one worship set or one sermon, but that we can see glimpses of God all around us every day, whether that's through nature, whether that's through other people, whether that's through silence, whether that's through conversation, and that we can become aware of God all the time. I was having a conversation with a pastor just yesterday or the day before, and we were talking about contemplative stuff, and he says, God doesn't exist in an illusion. God exists in reality. And most of the time, we're just simply unaware that God is in reality around us all the time, as close to us as our very breath. And I've really resonated with that I think many, and so much of Scripture, right, says there's Jesus, one of Jesus's favorite word is see. Do you see these people? Do you see this? He asked the disciples, do you see what's going on? And then throughout Scripture, the word remember is all throughout it. And I think we as Christians, the more we remember who God is and what God has done, and the more we see, the more we will be able to know that God is with us at all times, as close to us as our breath, doing a work in our world, even when we are unaware of it. So that's my hope for the Christian faith. And I think hopefully that will resonate with you, because I feel like you as a community, you are the type who are seeing every facet of the diamond, that you as a community have been opening yourselves up to God since your church was founded in the 50s, and that you continue to open yourselves up to God through contemplative practices, that you are aware that God is present with you all the time, that God is as close to your very breath, but that also these are the practices that are sustaining each of you to make the world more just and more whole. And so I think in some ways, the Church of the Covenant, you are contemplative ecumenicals. And maybe I'm just catching up to you. So I appreciate this time, and hopefully that resonates with you in some capacity.